much, Count Corla, and I want to thank the Labour Party for bringing forward a motion which, while I do not support, is also a very valuable opportunity for the Dáil to reflect on where our economy and where our society, where citizens and workers stand today, as we continue to see very significant change happen within our economy and very significant new pressures developing within our economy, which I want to acknowledge and say a word about in my statement here today. In opening up my statement, I do want to acknowledge where there is some common ground between the issues that are being raised by the Labour Party and also by the analysis that I and the government have regarding where we are. I want to acknowledge that for many families, for many workers and for many employers, particularly small and medium-sized employers, that just as we hope we have put the very darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic behind us, just as we hope we have put the huge economic insecurity, the huge economic anxiety and the basic fear that workers in this House had to confront over recent years regarding would a job still be available once we had defeated this pandemic. Just as we have done our best with that set of fears and challenges, many families, many businesses, many workers now find themselves confronting and dealing with a cost of living, with prices on their key essential utilities and services that is rising far more quickly than has been the case in their recent experience. And I want to acknowledge the added level of worry and challenge that is presenting to many at the moment, particularly those who are on fixed income, particularly those who are on low wages within our economy. So in that, the points that have been made by Deputy Nash, by Deputy Howland, by others in recent days, want to acknowledge. But I do want to make two other points which have not been present here in the debate today. The first point being, as we exit from this pandemic, we have a national debt for our country that is now over €250 billion, that many of the different demands that I've heard articulated here this morning regarding spending more and doing more don't reflect the fact that we now have, on a per capita basis, one of the highest levels of public debt in the developed world. And that matters too for the living standards and for the prospects of the citizens which are being discussed here this morning by the Dáil. The second point is just to underscore that while our economic prospects are changing, they are getting better in terms of where we are with jobs, with the retention of jobs and creating more jobs in the future. We can't forget the risks that we were aware of before we entered into the very dark days of this pandemic. The risks that have been raised with me by some in this House, by many outside of this House, regarding where we stand with corporate tax in the future, with a reliance on corporate tax revenue that indeed has deepened as we have moved through the darker days of this pandemic. But of course, that revenue was coming in at exactly a point in which we needed it. And the further area of difference, which again I think is telling here in this debate, when we've had many, many debates in this House regarding the state of our economy, they have been, during the pandemic, debates that have been dominated by how can we keep a job? How can we ensure that those who are on the pandemic unemployment payment will have a job to go back to? How can we support the viability of employers exactly at a point in which we're asking those employers to close? And I want to acknowledge the role of the Labour Party in ideas they brought forward during the pandemic, and indeed the support they did offer for many measures that were brought forward by the government for dealing with COVID. I also want to acknowledge, seeing the debate that broke out there across the opposition benches, that indeed if it wasn't for the role of the Labour Party and some of the deputies that are putting this motion forward here this evening, if it wasn't for their role during equally dark days in our country before the pandemic hit, that we would not, I believe, be in a position that we had an economy that was recovering, national finances that were in such good condition before the pandemic hit. It's a point that won't be acknowledged by others, but I want to acknowledge the role they played in getting us to this point. But having acknowledged where we agree with, and having also made the point about where we differ, before I go on to address what the government has done and what the government is willing to do in the future, I again want to do all of this in the spirit of saying that we do recognise the challenge and do understand the added anxiety, added worry that many workers are facing at the moment, that many families and many businesses are facing at the moment. But that is exactly what guided the introduction of measures in Budget 2022 that are now being implemented. Measures that were about how you deal with a cost of living that we did expect to increase, the clear warning signs of which began apparent across October, November and December. It is the reason why we have brought forward a range of social welfare measures, dealing most importantly with the key rates, increases of €5 that make a difference to those who are on them, though I do acknowledge that with the pressure that is there, they will be looking at how will they deal with a cost of living that is increasing. But this is the reason why then the government brought forward not just a change in the key rates, we also brought forward changes in the qualified child allowance. We also brought forward changes in the energy payments. We also brought forward payments in the working family payment. We made increases in those payments exactly in anticipation of the kind of challenges that many are facing at the moment. It's also why the government brought forward through Minister Donnelly measures to help families with the affordability of medical care and health care in relation to GP care, in relation to prescription costs, again recognising that this is adding to the cost that many are facing at the moment. And it is also the reason why the government brought forward measures to try to slow down and where we can freeze the increase in costs that many are facing with regard to childcare. So the government has brought forward measures, has put forward a package to try to deal with challenges that are there at the moment. But it is also the reason why we brought forward changes and increases in personal tax credits, and we brought forward measures to increase the amount of income at which somebody can pay or would be paying the lower rate of tax as opposed to the higher rate of tax. We brought forward measures in all of those which do make a difference to every taxpayer in the country. And these were measures that were resisted by this House. These are measures that this House voted against. And the reality, Count Corla, is that if I had not brought forward those measures, the deputies who voted against the measures that I introduced would be here today accusing me of presiding over stealth charges. They would be accusing me of not making changes that are needed for low and middle income workers to make a contribution to their after-tax pay rising with the cost of living. And that is an essential area of difference. I believe, and this government believes, that changes, affordable changes in relation to personal taxation, at a time in which the cost of living is changing, is an increased burden for many, is a core part of how we can respond back to the challenges that are there. And I did indeed hear Deputy Murphy made the point that for some tax, particularly in relation to income tax, as wages and as the cost of living increases, this automatically, in many cases, can make a difference to the level of personal taxes that are collected by the state. What I believe is at a time of rising inflation, at a time in which wages are changing for that and for other reasons, it's very important to use a share of that to help workers deal with this increased cost of living. But it is a reality that that is a measure that was opposed by many who are supporting this measure here today. It is also why the government, through Minister Ryan, has recently introduced a measure which is to help with the increased cost of energy at a time in which that cost of energy is really biting for many. And again, I hear from many descriptions that it is tokenistic, descriptions that it should go further. The key argument here I'd make to the House this morning is the importance of seeing all of these measures in the round. If you look at the measures that I've just detailed here this morning, Count Corla, it is measures that are between 1.2 and 1.3 billion euro implemented through the budget. Further changes this year to help with what we acknowledge to be a rising challenge for so many. And then I heard Deputy Collins conclude with saying what we need is a revolution. What we need is progress. What we need is this state, having shown its ability to stand by citizens at a time of such challenge. We are seeing the effect of our efforts now as we see an economy that shows the signs of beginning to recover very strongly. And what I will do, and what this government will do, Ceann Comhairle, in conclusion, is we will use the proceeds of this, a recovery that has been delivered by the stamina, by the resilience of our country, combined with the right decisions by this government and the last government, to continue to do all we can to make a difference to what we acknowledge is a rising burden, a rising cost and an additional source of anxiety for so many. Thank you.